In the aftermath of Germany's surrender in May 1945, Berlin lay in ruins, its streets shattered, buildings reduced to skeletal shells, and citizens desperate for bread, water, and shelter. Amidst this chaos, the Soviets moved swiftly to consolidate control over the eastern sector. One of their first initiatives was the establishment of the Deutsche Volks Polizei, commonly known as the DVP or VOPO. These men would become the backbone of law enforcement in what would later emerge as the German Democratic Republic. The Soviet Military Administration, or SMAD, began recruiting German officers almost immediately after the war. Some were former members of the Nazi state police whose insignias were removed, while others wore pre-1933 uniforms if they could be found. These officers, though officially tasked with maintaining order, were instruments of political control. Many were ex-soldiers, captured communists, or even former Nazis whose skills and loyalties were overlooked for expediency. Their selection was less about moral character or law enforcement competence, and more about opportunism and political reliability. Uniforms carried symbolism. Some wore the classic Yako helmets, originally introduced after World War I, reminiscent of the Reich's protective police, the Schupo. These visual reminders connected the past to a new, Soviet-aligned order. Under Nazi rule, German policing had been centralized and heavily politicized. Now the Soviets imposed a similar structure, blending authority and ideology to ensure compliance in a city still reeling from defeat. Berlin in 1945 was a city of scarcity and desperation. Basic resources were nearly non-existent. Trees that once lined grand boulevards were chopped down for firewood. Food and labor were controlled through ration cards, the most vital of which was the hunger card, issued to those without employment or access to state sustenance. Survival depended on navigating this bleak reality. The Tiergarten, remnants of Berlin's largest parks, became hubs of black market activity. Citizens bartered everything from silverware to cameras, even sexual favors, in exchange for food, cigarettes, or Allied military marks. The Allied military marks served as temporary currency across occupied Germany. Soviets received payment in these marks, which they could not convert to rubles, while American GIs often exchanged them at inflated rates. This fueled a bustling underground economy, drawing in the desperate, especially women, children, and the elderly, who were easily exploited. Amid this chaos, the VOPO operated as both enforcers and opportunists. Initially untrained and poorly equipped, some officers were handed pistols from surplus German stockpiles, and later, more formidable arms like the STG-44. By 1946, over 22,000 Germans served in these units, undergoing a rudimentary on-the-job training program that emphasized political loyalty as much as operational competence. High turnover, around 50%, was common, reflecting both the harsh conditions and political vetting. The political environment further tested the fledgling police force. Events such as the 1949 Berlin railway strike, triggered by West Germany's introduction of its own currency, placed thousands of striking railway workers against police and Soviet authorities. Maintaining control required both manpower and strategic acumen, highlighting the growing importance of the VOPO as an instrument of state power. These early years cemented the dual nature of the VOPO, part law enforcement, part political enforcer. They policed black markets, rationing violations, and post-war crimes, while ensuring that any political dissent was quickly identified and neutralized. For Berliners, the line between law and oppression blurred, as the VOPO navigated both duties with the efficiency and ruthlessness dictated by Soviet oversight. By 1949, the German Democratic Republic was formally established. The VOPO was now institutionalized, serving not merely as police but as guardians of the socialist regime. A purge of officers ensured that only politically reliable men remained. Veterans with ties to West Germany were expelled, and loyalty to the Socialist Unity Party became paramount. Training emphasized obedience and ideological conformity, creating a police force that functioned as an extension of the state's authority. The VOPO's early years were marked by both improvisation and brutality. With no standardized training, officers learned through experience, often with violent consequences. They policed Berlin's streets and emerging black markets, but they were also themselves participants in the corruption and opportunism that pervaded post-war life. For the Soviets, this was acceptable, as long as the men upheld the broader goals of control and compliance. The introduction of pistols and later more advanced firearms signaled the VOPO's growing influence. These weapons allowed them to enforce rationing, quell strikes, and intimidate citizens who might challenge the new order. Their authority grew, not through public trust or community service, but through fear and coercion. While Berliners struggled to survive, the VOPO solidified the foundation of a surveillance state. Every action, from ration card compliance to black market participation, was observed. Political loyalty became the metric for effectiveness, not justice or fairness. The state's need for control in a devastated city meant that officers' past affiliations, even with the Nazi regime, were secondary to their willingness to serve Soviet objectives. As the VOPO grew, so did the infrastructure of the new police state. Centralized command structures, combined with politically motivated purges, created a hierarchy loyal to Moscow and the SED. Officers were conditioned to suppress dissent, enforce political orthodoxy, and maintain order in a city that had little patience for ideology, but immense need for stability. Berlin's post-war reality was harsh: ruined infrastructure, food scarcity, and a populace traumatized by war. In this environment, the VOPO became both enforcers and symbols of the new regime's power. By controlling the flow of resources and surveilling citizens, they ensured that survival depended on compliance. Those who resisted risked arrest, violence, or worse. By the late 1940s, the VOPO was a powerful entity, evolving from opportunistic enforcers to the backbone of a totalitarian policing system. Their influence extended beyond simple law enforcement. They became the eyes, ears, and instruments of the socialist state, setting the stage for decades of surveillance, control, and political repression in East Germany. By the early 1950s, the VOPO had transformed from a provisional police force into a highly politicized institution, central to the authority of the German Democratic Republic. Officers were now trained explicitly to safeguard the socialist state, enforcing laws while simultaneously suppressing political dissent. Their mission extended far beyond conventional policing. They became guardians of ideology and instruments of fear. Following the 1953 East German uprising, the state conducted a massive purge. 12,000 officers were removed for unreliability, ensuring that only the most loyal remained. The remaining VOPO members were indoctrinated in both socialist principles and operational discipline. Their role was no longer simply to enforce law, it was to maintain the regime's monopoly on power. Citizens became both the subjects and the objects of surveillance, with the VOPO monitoring neighborhoods, workplaces, and even private interactions. The VOPO's activities were far-reaching. They patrolled urban centers and rural towns, intervened in labor disputes, and investigated political infractions. Their surveillance extended into private life, identifying dissenters, potential defectors, and anyone whose behavior could undermine the socialist order. In essence, the VOPO functioned as a domestic intelligence force blending policing and espionage. Berlin's black markets persisted into the 1950s, but the VOPO's presence curbed their influence. Officers conducted raids, confiscating goods, arresting violators, and imposing fines. While some officers exploited these opportunities for personal gain, the overarching aim was to control economic activity and ensure compliance with state regulations. Black market activity was not merely a criminal issue, it represented a challenge to state authority and required political as well as operational intervention. The VOPO's structure mirrored the state's priorities. Promotions and assignments were heavily influenced by political loyalty, and officers were constantly evaluated for ideological conformity. Training programs emphasized the party line, equipping officers to handle demonstrations, labor unrest, and potential espionage. Every aspect of policing was politicized. Arrests, investigations, and even routine patrols were instruments of control. Beyond Berlin, the VOPO played a central role in consolidating the GDR's authority across East Germany. They supported border enforcement, supervised transportation hubs, and monitored communication channels. Their presence ensured that the socialist state maintained a tight grip on both information and movement, preventing the spread of dissent or influence from West Germany. By the mid-1950s, the VOPO had evolved into a disciplined and centralized force, yet it retained its roots in opportunism and survival. Many early officers, once selected for their wartime affiliations or willingness to cooperate with the Soviets, now found themselves navigating a professionalized hierarchy. The state's emphasis on loyalty over competence persisted, shaping a police culture that valued obedience and conformity above individual judgment or moral considerations. The VOPO's influence extended into education, media, and culture. They enforced curfews, monitored public gatherings, and ensured that citizens adhered to the state's ideological norms. Opposition, whether in the form of passive resistance or active protest, was met with swift and often severe consequences. Political dissent was not tolerated, and officers were expected to report any perceived deviation from socialist values. The legacy of the VOPO shaped the GDR for decades. They created a climate of fear, but also one of order, where the state maintained absolute control over public life. Surveillance, political loyalty, and enforcement of ideological conformity became the core of their mission. The police were no longer neutral arbiters of law. They were instruments of political power, a model replicated in various forms throughout the Eastern Bloc. By the late 1950s, the VOPO's role was firmly established. They had transitioned from a makeshift post-war force into a monolithic policing system, embedded deeply within the machinery of the state. Their influence reached into every facet of life, from economic activity to personal conduct. Obedience to the party line was paramount, and deviation was met with immediate and often severe consequences. Berlin citizens, long accustomed to post-war scarcity and chaos, now faced a different kind of control. The VOPO maintained order through a combination of authority, surveillance, and fear. Citizens complied not merely out of respect for the law, but from recognition of the state's omnipresence and the consequences of disobedience. The transformation of the VOPO illustrates how a post-war police force, initially assembled for practicality and survival, became an essential instrument of political power. From policing black markets and ration violations to suppressing labor strikes and monitoring ideology, the VOPO shaped East Germany's society and governance. Their evolution reflects both the exigencies of post-war reconstruction and the ambitions of a state determined to maintain absolute control over its citizens. By the early 1960s, the VOPO had fully integrated into the state apparatus, a permanent fixture of the GDR's political and social landscape. The men who once enforced ration cards and patrolled the streets of a shattered Berlin were now seasoned enforcers of socialist authority, embodying the merger of policing and politics. Their history stands as a testament to how law enforcement can be transformed by ideology, circumstance, and power, and the consequences that follow when policing serves the state above its people.